um, it's nice to be love your neighbor as yourself, but why is that a rule? Why is that a foundation of the Torah? Okay, why is that a foundation of the Torah? So one of the reasons for V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, we could say, is that in order that there should be shalom, in order that there should be a unity between people. People should be together. There should be no machlokes. There should be no dispute, right? People shouldn't fight with each other. There should be shalom. So we have a Mishnah that says, with Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, the Mishnah says, Hil Avi Omer, Hil used to say, have a mitamidim shel Aaron, you should be from the students of Aaron. Oyev shalom v'oyev shalom. He loved peace and he was seeking peace. Oyev zabriyas u'makarim l'Torah. You should love people and bring them close to the Torah. So you see that shalom, which is powered by, so to speak, shalom, which is powered by V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. If people love each other as themselves, then they can be together. And if they're together, there's shalom between them, right? And that's how you can be makar from the Torah. That's how you can bring them close to the Torah, as the Mishnah says, right? So the reason, as we know, ironically speaking, my Rebbe said, what is the reason that the students of Rebbe Akiva die? The reason why the Gemara says there in Yivam is that the reason why the students of Rebbe Akiva died is because they didn't honor each other. Which sounds like that there was a lacking in the V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, which sounds like that there was a lacking in loving your neighbor as yourself. And because of that, because they didn't love their neighbor as themselves, therefore they didn't afford each other proper honor. Since they didn't afford each other proper honor, they didn't have shalom. And since they didn't have shalom, they weren't together. And since they weren't together, they lacked the prerequisite that was necessary for Torah Shabbat Peh. They lacked the prerequisite that was necessary for the oral law. Since they lacked the prerequisite that was necessary for the oral law, then what they were doing was they were undermining their entire task. Because what Rabbi Akiva was teaching them was the oral law. So if Rabbi Akiva was teaching them the oral law that would be passed down through generations, but they didn't have the foundation of the oral law, which is love your neighbor as yourself, then they can't pass down through generations. Therefore, they passed away. The reason why they passed away is because they could not be the conduits. They could not be the transfer device of the oral law. The reason why is because they were lacking the foundational requirements for the oral law, and that is love your neighbor as yourself. That's what my Rebbe said. And therefore my Rebbe said, and the Jewish people have to be one. As it says in Parshas Yisro, my Rebbe said, it says in Parshas Yisro, Vayichan Yisrael Sham Neged Ahar, that the Jewish people encamped underneath the mountain. It says it in the singular form that they encamped. And there Rashi says, Ki ish echad b'lev echad, they were like one person with one heart. So you see that in order to receive the Torah, you have to be one person. You have to be b'shalom. You have to have V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. You have to love your neighbor as yourself. And if you're not, then you can't receive the Torah. And therefore the students of Rabbi Akiva died. Right? Therefore, Rabbi Akiva, specifically during this period, which period is that? During the period between Pesach and Shavuos, which is the period when we count the days of the Omer, and what we're doing is basically the days of the Omer somehow are leading up to the holiday of Shavuos, and the holiday of Shavuos, as we say in the davening, is Man Matan Terasenu. It is the time of the giving of our Torah, and since it's the time of the giving of our Torah, we have to work on, or we have to have, in order to receive the Torah, in order to properly celebrate the holiday of Shavuos, we have to have this V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. We have to have the prerequisite of love your neighbor as yourself. Therefore, the students of Rabbi Akiva died during this period of time to teach us this lesson, that if we don't have the prerequisites for the receiving of the Torah, V'ahavta l'recha kamocha, then we cannot receive the Torah, just like the students of Rabbi Akiva could not receive the Torah. This is what my Rebbe said. So this explains the period. This explains the period of the this explains the period of the Omer, right? This explains the period this explains the period of the Omer. So why is it that Rabbi Akiva's students died? Because they didn't honor each other in this period of time leading up to receiving of the Torah. And that is because the prerequisite for the receiving of the Torah is v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. In order for a person to learn Torah, in order for a person to be involved in Torah, which means to be close to Hashem, which means to be on Har Sinai, they have to have the v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. They have to love their neighbor as themselves. That is why we have the mourning period, in order to encourage us, to inspire us to try to work on the attribute of loving our neighbor as ourselves. V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. That's what the Rebbe said. So this explains why in general we have the Omer period of mourning during this time. We still haven't explained though the holiday of Lag BaOmer, which is tomorrow night. But before we do that, we want to first explain, maybe elaborate on what my Rebbe said, is that why is it that the Ahavta L'Recha Kamocha is a prerequisite for the receiving of the Torah? So we said the reason why it's a prerequisite for receiving the Torah is because when you have Ahavta L'Recha Kamocha, then you have people get along. If people get along, then they're together. If people are together, then they're one. Once they're one, then Hashem can give the Torah. But let's see, maybe there's a deeper explanation for this. Maybe there's a deeper explanation of why this is true. Why is it that true? Why does one have to be one? Why does everybody have to be unified in order to receive the Torah? Why can't it be that people are not unified? Maybe Hashem can give the Torah to an ununified nation, a separate nation, people who are not getting along. Why not? Right? This is the question. So perhaps we can answer it with the Alter of Kelm. I'd like to read the beginning of the Alter of Kelm in the Chachma Musar. Chachma Musar, volume 1, in Maimer number 1, he has this Maimer called Nechmad V'Noyim. So I'd like to just read the beginning of it, where he basically explains this idea. He basically explains this idea of why this is true. And then after we do that, then we're going to finish explaining my Rebbe, and then we're going to say why Lag BaOmer, from an exoteric perspective, is a holiday. Okay, so here he says the other comes like this. He says Amru Chazal, that it says in Pirkei Avos chapter 6. It says in Pirkei Avos, one of the attributes which the Torah is acquired is Noiseh Ba'olam Chaveroi. It is that one should carry the burden with one's friend. Okay? A person, in order to acquire Torah, they need to be able to empathize with the plight of their fellow man. He says, and why is that true? What does one have to do to the other? One is to be a nice person, and one has to do with an intellectual study. So how are the two related? Why is that a prerequisite? Which is essentially the same question that we have just asked. Right? He says, all of the attributes that are listed there, they are like a purpose they're like a purpose to other attributes that a person can acquire. That cause the purpose to come about, to be fulfilled. What happens is that the person has these attributes, including the attribute of relating to one's friends, being empathetic to their plight, changes a person in kind. It transforms an individual into something else, a different person, when all these attributes are taken together. And that transformation changes a person, that when that person now is changed, then they're able to attach themselves to the Torah. Meaning to say like this, that before a person is involved in empathy and loving one neighbor as oneself and having the attributes of kindness, they are not for some reason fit for the Torah. But after they transform themselves into a person who's kind and a person who's empathetic, etc., then they transform themselves into a person that's fit for the Torah for some reason. And what is that? Once they transformed and attached to the Torah, then they get attached, they get tied up in the tying of life forever. Ubilti zoisi avshalit Torah. Without this, a person would not be able to acquire Torah. She betachas haruchni is because it is a spiritual. The Torah itself is a spiritual entity. Li davik ben nefesh lo zakah, and therefore, since the Torah is a spiritual entity, it will not be able to cling on to a soul that is not pure. He adena megushemes, which is still physical in nature, which is still something which is a physicality. So he says like this, the Alter of Kim. In order for a person to be able to be empathetic to another person's plight, it's not possible. A person has to be, the only way to do it is a person has to make themselves accustomed in loving their friends with action and with thought. The action is obvious. Tzedakah, giving them a ride, helping them walk somewhere, all the actions that are purported to be kind actions. Walking an old lady across the street, right? These actions are obvious. These are the actions that a person has to become accustomed to. It should become to them something which they're used to doing on a regular basis, in order to be able to become an empathetic person who helps other people. However, thought is also required, and that is not revealed to many people. And it depends on two things, he says. One is very simple, and that is to be able to consider and to be able to ponder in one's mind how an I guess, for lack of a better word, how the dynamic between people should be, in order that they should have a prosperous, not progressive, but you should have a prosperous, functional society that is let's say, a positive ecosystem of give and take between people, right? That people are accustomed to helping each other, so that the society functions and is self-sufficient. So he says, and then otherwise the world cannot survive this. And the opposite would be that the world would be destroyed. And therefore, when there's hatred between people, that's destructive to the world. And that's why the Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. The Beis Hamikdash was destroyed, as the Gemara tells us in Tractate Yom on page 9b, because of hatred, baseless hatred. Why? That the Beis Hamikdash itself, the Beis Hamikdash is the attachment of the world. And who is in charge of the Beis Hamikdash? The Jewish people, right? And when the Jewish people sin in this specific area of sinas china, or basis hatred, nitzika kesher, the tie that is of the world is cut off. And then the Beis Hamikdash has to be destroyed. Hashem should return it to us quickly. So therefore, in order to be able to empathetic, the first thing in order to be empathetic to a person's plight is a person has to come to the recognition that it's the only way to go in terms of the world's in terms of the functionality of the world. If a person is only for themselves and they exclude other people, even if they don't, there's no baseless hatred. Baseless hatred is the how should you say it, is the bastardization of this idea of being selfish, right? Not only are you selfish, but you also push away in your selfishness everybody else because of the hatred for them. So in order to be empathetic to people's plight, is a person has to understand, what can I do to help them, because they are a part of my society, they're a part of my group, they're a part of my family, they're a part of my community, right? And the community needs to function properly. And if we just let people go in the community without helping them, then the whole community doesn't function properly. that affects the entire community. So a person, says the Aleph Kelm, should think about these things. He says, but in order to be able to ponder like this, in order for a person to think this way, a person has to remove from them physicality. Why? Because a person has, if a person is selfish, then they're being very physical. They're being in tuned and caring about themselves. In order to be unselfish, meaning to care about others, a person has to be removed from themselves. In order to be, if they're removed from themselves, then they're removed from their own physicality. So therefore, there's a spiritual element to being empathetic to other people. Person has to be selfless, and that's a spiritual element, a transformation into spirituality. And the more a person is able to separate themselves from the physicality, right, the more they're able to do the then what happens is that the spirituality becomes unified within the person and within the community. Because in spirituality, when the physicality is removed, all the spiritual things are like magnets. They all attach themselves to each other. Because in spirituality, there is no separation. The separation is in the physical world because each item in the physical world is distinct. But in the spiritual world, there's no such physical distinction which separates the spirit. The spirit. In physicality, there's no true unity. Because physicality is grafted from many different pieces, right? And therefore, a person who seeks their own pleasure is going to be separate from everybody else, as it says in Mishlei 18:1. Okay, so if that's the case, says the Alter Kelm, he says, we already explained, and therefore now we understand. What was our original question? Our original question is that why does a person, in order to acquire Torah, which is an intellectual endeavor, need to be noiseh ba'olim chaveroi? Why do they have to be able to carry the yoke of their friend, be able to empathize with their friend? The reason why is because it just happens to be a convenience. If a person is able to empathize with their friend, then in order to be able to empathize with their friend, they have to be selfless. In order to be selfless, they have to be spiritual. And in order to be able to be a person has to develop themselves spiritually. That spirituality makes them one with the entire community. Once a person reaches that level of spirituality, then they become fit. Their soul has been transformed into a fitting body that is able to receive the Torah. Why? Because the Torah is also a spiritual entity, right? And that is really what is the endurance of the soul, even after a person dies, in truth. Now we understand what the rabbis say, as my Rebbe quoted. Here it's quoted as the Medrash Rabbah in 24:8. That Rabbi Akiva says, you should love your neighbor as yourself. This is the klal gadol. This is the rule. This is the rule of the Torah. So now we understand. Rabbi Akiva was saying. Rabbi Akiva who's the father of the oral law. Rabbi Akiva. Remember the question that we asked. We said that why is it that the foundation for the oral law needs to be v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. It needs to be love your neighbor as yourself, like Rabbi Akiva said. The reason why it needs to be that foundation is because in order to be able v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself, requires a spiritual development, to the point where once the person develops spiritually this way, then they can attach themselves to the Torah, which is a spiritual entity. That's why Rabbi Akiva conveniently said, imagine, Rabbi Akiva said, perhaps maybe Rabbi Akiva was even saying, we could say this in an apocryphal sense maybe, that Rabbi Akiva was saying, you know why my students died? He didn't actually say this, but we're saying that he could have said this. You know why my students died? Because they didn't honor each other properly. Not honoring each other properly is a lack in the V'ahavta l'recha kamocha. A lack in the V'ahavta l'recha kamocha is a lack in the spiritual development. A lack in that spiritual development makes them incompatible with the Torah, which is spiritual, and therefore they can't be the conduit of Torah Shabbat Pe'er, of the oral law, right? Ki adam aruchni bal nefesh hayafa, because only a spiritual person who has a good soul, nafshim is dabekis b'Torah la'ava u'lishamra b'machshava, his soul, that he's able to love the Torah, to keep it in his thoughts, of mice in his actions. Kashi yidabik ba'avas hachomer hagas u'mekol shekim b'tzachzu charuchnis l'malarosh. So that's what the author says is the reason why. This is what the author says is the reason why it's required that a person who's a noiseba, that in order to acquire Torah, what is required to be already a prerequisite of noiseba olam chavera. They have to be able to relate to the yoke, to be able to carry the yoke with their friend, to be able to be empathetic to their plight. Okay? Questions? No? Okay. So this is what, so now we understand from the Alter of Kelm a little bit more of what my Rebbe said. What the that's already what my Rebbe said. He continues. This is a very what should we say, a Gishmaka piece. This specific mimer, which goes in depth about this particular issue and gives examples and points out more things. But for us, this is will serve our purpose. So this explains again. This explains why. This explains why what we have the mourning period for the students of Rabbi Akiva during this time when we're leading up to the holiday of Shavuos to receiving of the Torah. Okay. Now we get to the Lag BaOmer. Now we're going to get to the Lag BaOmer issue. Yes.
Just one quick question. So with the students, then they're studying, and the difficulty for them was crossing that threshold of loving the neighbor as yourself, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And by not having that, so the foundation was not there, so they can't be a conduit, like you said.
Right.
Is in the context you're saying, is it the reverse for us? In other words, if we mastered love of our fellow, we could then become a conduit for.
Yeah, it's true. Yeah, we would be able to approach the Torah much easier.
Okay.
We would be on a spiritual level, we'd be able to approach the Torah much easier. We would understand the Torah much easier. We'd be able to sit down with the Gemara and a Chumash and be able to read it. It'd be easier for us to read it because we would be a transformed individuals. Okay, now we get to the exoteric reasoning for Lag BaOmer, which we'll speculate. Okay, let's say like this. Remember, we said that one of the 5 students of Rabbi Akiva, by the way, was Reb Shimon. Who is Reb Shimon? That's Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai is the man that centered, is the Tana that centered around the holiday of Lag BaOmer. That Reb Shimon Bar Yochai died on Lag BaOmer, right? This is the holiday is celebrating Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Go back to our podcast last year where we explained this at length. But Reb Shimon Bar Yochai was one of the 5 students of Rabbi Akiva. Now, so the Gemara said in the Gemara said in Sanhedrin 86, as we said, that Reb Shimon, what is Reb Shimon? Reb Shimon is Stam. Reb Shimon is, what do we say? Stam Sifri is Rabbi Shimon. What's the Sifri? The Sifri is the halachic medrash of the book of Bamidbar and the book of Dvarim. Of the book of Bamidbar and the book of Dvarim. So that's what he is. So now let's explain the book of Dvarim for a minute. The book of Dvarim is called the Mishnah Torah. The book of Dvarim is called the Mishnah Torah. Now, what did the words Mishnah Torah mean? So there's a big discussion amongst the Rishonim and Achronim what it means. One of the people that offers the opinion is the Hemik Davra of the Neftoah Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of the Volozhina Yeshiva. In the middle he happens in the middle of his introduction to the book of Dvarim, he quotes Reb Shimon Bar Yochai in the Medrash. The same Reb Shimon Bar Yochai who was the student of Rabbi Akiva. He says like this. I want to read it also, the Hamikdav. The Hamikdav says like this. In Bereshis Rabbah, in chapter 6, it says like Isa, it says like this. Amar Reb Shimon Bar Yochai. Reb Shimon Bar Yochai said, Mishnah Torah he signon li Yeshua. Mishnah Torah is representative of Yeshua, who is the successor of Moshe Rabbeinu. Why? Because when Hashem came and revealed himself to Yeshua, he found him and he was sitting and he had a Sefer Torah in his hand. Sorry, the Sefer and Mishnah Torah biyado, and he was learning the book of Dvarim. That's what the Medrash says. This is what Shimon Bar Yochai tells us in the Medrash, that he was learning the book of Dvarim. So it says the Hemik Davar, why? Because this book, the book of Dvarim, is the book from which you can extrapolate all of the different facets of Musar, of ethics. It says by the king in Parsha Shoftim, it says what? Because of law as Mishnah HaTorah. It says that he'll write for himself a second book, which is this, and the way the Torah calls it is it calls it Mishnah Torah, which happens to be the same name as Dvarim. And why does he need to have why does he need to have his own Sefer Torah, the king, a second Sefer Torah? Why? He needs to the mitzvahs ksiva hoisa kol Torah kula b'shleimus davka. Even though the mitzvahs ksiva hoisa kol Torah kula b'shleimus davka, even though the mitzvahs ksivas hoisa kol Sefer Torah, the mitzvah of writing for the king, the mitzvah of writing is to write the whole Sefer Torah, all the 5 books of Moses, the whole entire Pentateuch. Right? However, the specific reason why he has to write the whole Sefer Torah is because of Mishnah Torah, as the Torah calls it Mishnah Torah, which is the book of Dvarim. Because the king should look in the book of Dvarim continually or continuously to reach the purpose that is necessary for that. That he should be, what should we say? That he should be erudite in Musar, in ethics of the Torah. Laman Yilmad Liyira, in order that he should be able to, as the pasuk says, to fear Hashem, Lishmar as mitzvah, to keep his mitzvahs, v'goymer, lebilti v'rava, not become arrogant, v'lebiti sor min mitzvah, and in order he should keep the mitzvah. And the Yesh Lahavin Mikol says the Hemik Davar, one should understand from all of this that if a person learns the book of Dvarim and is careful to be exact in learning the Musar that's in this book, that came from the mouth of Moshe Rabbeinu with divine inspiration, a person will find honey and milk. They will enjoy it according to their level. In Parshas Ekev, it says, and what does Hashem ask of you? Mimach. Parshas says, what does he ask of you? He asks you to fear Hashem, to love Hashem. And that could be called from the Mishnah Torah. And that's what it means that Yeshua, when Hashem revealed himself to Yeshua was learning the book of Dvarim. We can even say the following. We could say that the same way that Moshe is the, so to speak, the father of the written law, right? Which would be represented by the first 4 books of the Torah, right? Yeshua, his successor, so to speak, which the Mishnah Torah, which is the book of Dvarim that he has in his hands, is the concentrated Musar, the ethics of the Torah, right? Which are required for the first 4 books. Yeshua is learning that 5th book. Rabbi Yeshua Hishkiv is a Sefer Tam, and that's why he looked at it continually. And therefore, everybody should, according to their level, study it. The or zeh sefer, and the light of this book will be or ner leraglo, will be a light to his feet. So the reason why it's called Mishnah Torah is because it's referring to the Torah that is being written by the Jewish king. So you see what? You see that the book of Dvarim represents the ethics of the Torah. Correct? Now, who is Stam Sifri? Who is Stam Sifri? In other words, who is the Medrash of the Halacha Medrash of the book of Dvarim, which is one of the 5 students of Rabbi Akiva? That's Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, right? So therefore, the Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai represents the book of Dvarim. But not only is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai in the book of Dvarim, which is the ethics of the Torah, but also Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is the 4th book, which is the book of Bamidbar, which we could say is the end of the Torah. Meaning, who completes the Torah, so to speak? Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because the medrash that he of halacha that he is the author of is also for the book of Bamidbar. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai has a disproportionate representation in the 5 books. He represents the last 2 books of the Torah, right? So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, we could say that he's the completion of the Torah, and he's also the beginning of the Musar of the Torah. Maybe we can suggest that because of what we said. So perhaps we could say like this. Maybe we could say like this, that in the Shalos V'Tshuvos, in the response of Rabbi Avad Yosef, if I'm not mistaken, in response number 35, I think in the notes there, he says, according to some commentaries, that not only did Reb Shimon Bar Yochai die on Lag BaOmer, but also the date at which, again, remember the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva died, and then Rabbi Akiva got together his 5 students to teach them Torah subsequently. What was the day that he started teaching them? So these Mefarshim say that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai started teaching them on Lag BaOmer also. And that's why we make such a big party, not because of the Yortzeit of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but we make such a big party because that was the day that Rabbi Akiva taught the oral law started to teach the oral law to his 5 students, amongst whom was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. So we could say that the holiday of Lag BaOmer is really a celebration of the teaching of the oral law. Right, the holiday of Lag BaOmer is really a celebration of the teaching of the oral law of Rabbi Akiva to his 5 students. But it also, but also, who is disproportionately representative of the oral law within those 5 students is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, because Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai represents the book of Bamidbar, which is the completion of the actual, so to speak, Torah, and he also represents the 5th book, which is the also continuation of the Torah, but it's the ethics and the Musar, like the Hemik Davar says of the Torah. So Rabbi Shimon, so the representation of the transference of the oral law, aside from Rabbi Akiva, who is the Rebbe, but through whom it was transferred, is Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. And when did Rabbi Akiva start teaching his students the Torah on Lag BaOmer? That's why we have the holiday of Lag BaOmer. So here's our speculation on the exoteric reason of why Lag BaOmer is such a holiday without any mysticism involved, which could be maybe oxymoronic. It could be oxymoronic, perhaps, maybe, but that's the way it is. So and what is the and again, what is the yesod? We would say, what is the yesod of the, and that's why Lag BaOmer also happens, even though it's the 33rd day of the Omer, but it also happens within this period of time. Like my Rebbe said, it happens during the period leading up to Kabbalah Satorah, right? So therefore, the most acute moment of the entire counting of the Omer leading up to Shavuos is Lag BaOmer, because that's when Rabbi Akiva started teaching the oral law, which would be the explanation of the written law, which would be given in Har Sinai on Shavuos. started on Lag BaOmer. It started on Lag BaOmer. And the most and disproportionately representative of that whole beginning is Reb Shimon Bar Yochai, as we explained, and it happens to be that on that day also Reb Shimon Bar Yochai passed away. And so therefore we make a whole big holiday on Lag BaOmer. And that is also happens to be the day when Rabbi Akiva's, as we said, as everybody knows, that none of the students of Rabbi Akiva died, of the 24,000 on that day also. Okay. Anyway, so that's what I wanted to share with everyone. Any questions? No. Okay. So with this, we conclude. Thank you. Have a good Shabbos, everyone.